So today, as I mentioned, we will talk about some of the important saints of the church. As I was saying just a second ago, there are so many of them that I could not ever possibly talk about all of them in a course like this. So my hope in this particular list is to highlight some of the names that you will hear, either because they have larger services dedicated to them, or because they're just beloved and you'll run into a bunch of people named after them, or people just talk about them because they like them, read their stories, that kind of thing. A handful of these are ones that I particularly like and think are good to know about, but really, again, the goal here is to just give you a very broad stroke of a small handful at least of some of the bigger names you'll run into, from a few different categories. And again, just I'll probably say this a bunch of times through today, but there are so many others that are probably equally deserving, if not more, to be on this list. But this is what I came up with. So starting from the top, in the early church, the Theotokos takes the crown there. You'll find her in every parish. There's so many parishes named after her various feasts. We have many different feasts for her birth, her death, her falling asleep, her entrance into the temple, conception and nativity are considered to be feasts of the Lord, but she obviously features very prominently. She follows Jesus pretty much through his whole ministry, and though she's never kind of directly named in the Acts of the Apostles or in any of the stories of kind of the very early church and its functioning, we do know that she was active until her death in the church and supporting it, even though she wasn't front and center. As I've preached on several times, that is one of the reasons that we remember her. As I'm sure you're aware from other major religious groups, oftentimes when the guy dies, there's a split by, over which brother to follow or which son or which whatever. And she certainly could have led a faction if she had so desired. She was well loved at the time, but she doesn't do that, right? She understands that this is something well beyond her, much more important than her. And so she supports the church, but, we see in the Apostolic Council, right, in Jerusalem, when the apostles all come together and talk about whether you need to be a Jew first or if you can just be baptized, right? There's no mention of the Theotokos in any of that. I don't think it would be that wild or crazy to say that she was probably there, but she's not referenced, right? Do you remember who was leading it?
The Apostle James, right?
James, yeah, Bishop of Jerusalem was leading it. Not the Theotokos, right? Not Peter or anyone else, right? Anyway, there's so many people named after the Theotokos or her feasts. Very common. We have a whole section dedicated just to icons of her. So very well loved even to this day. And I've mentioned before, it's somewhat unfortunate about the particular space we're in, but most churches, when you walk in, if they're set up, built purposely to be an Orthodox church, you'll see staring right back at you from the top of the furthest dome is a very large icon of the Theotokos, basically right above the altar. So she is kept in a position of prominence, and very much loved and remembered to this day. Second, I think, right behind her is the apostles and the disciples, specifically the 12 and the 70, although there were also a number of women disciples that followed her and were the first to bear witness to the resurrection. The collection of all of them established and spread the faith throughout the whole world, as far as India and China and England and deep into Africa and far north into the Slavic lands. If you've been coming to Father's Cafe, we've been reading through the lives of many of the apostles, and you've heard some of the stories of their travels far and wide. And we see that, with only a few exceptions, pretty much all of the churches they established have continued in one form or another, right? And those few instances that they have more or less collapsed, it was a very deliberate and intentional act of someone. But generally speaking, they spread the faith over the world, and it has maintained spread over all the world. There are many churches named after apostles. There are many people. John is one of the most common names in the Orthodox world, here in America at least. So many different feasts associated with many of them. Obviously, the 12 all have their own feasts. Many of the 70 have named feasts as well. So it's pretty common through the year to see so-and-so of the 70 remembered as well. They don't tend to get high enough ranked feasts that they would have services outside of the daily ones like we do here, or if the parish was dedicated to them. But there were quite a few services dedicated to them. And then the last saint I have kind of in this early church period is St. Ignatius of Antioch. Again, there's many others here that we could go in, but he was likely a disciple of Saints Peter and John. He died in 107 AD, so very early. He was a bishop, a writer. Part of the reason I put him on here is because, though he obviously isn't the source for this, he's one of the first to describe the structure of the church that pretty much looks like it does now, having one bishop per city with priests and deacons assisting. He also...
Does he say priests?
He makes a difference between bishops and priests and deacons, yep. He also makes a big deal of the Eucharist. He's the first source we have that treats the Eucharist as something other than just a remembrance meal that we do because it's fun, right? He clearly shows that this is a big deal, as you see right after that. He calls it the medicine to immortality. That's not something you say of just a fun little meal you have together after you all hang out for a bit, right? He clearly sees it as something much more.
He also takes it very literally, the Gospel of John, when it's talking about the body and blood of Christ.
Yeah.
I guess he would be the best source outside of showing, like, yeah, no, it was very clearly understood that, literally laid that out.
Yep.
Yeah, he also, I've read St. Ignatius. I forgot what I said, but,
Another good contender for this would be St. Justin Martyr. He's the first, if you remember from the 101, to give in writing a description of the liturgy, and the purpose of his writing doesn't lend itself to an overly complex or detailed recording of what happens in the liturgy, but what he does say looks very similar to what we do today.
he says to treat the bishops as you would Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember.
So, many of the saints in this early church era.
I didn't know that he used the word priest, though. Did he?
I'm pretty sure.
I'm pretty sure. Okay.
I might not have to double check. Like I said, I can't remember all the things about all these people, but
I remember him specifically as far as the hierarchical order. He talks about the bishops and I guess presbyter, or I don't know.
yeah,
I'd have to check.
episcopos versus the presbyter. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, many of these early church saints give us a confirmation of what we already know to be true, which is that what we are doing was not made later by insert name people like to put, like Constantine or someone like that, right? But was the practice even very, very early in the church. So I highly recommend, if you're ever curious, to go look through some of these very early church saints.
And of course, it wouldn't be this structured, like at the very, very beginning. You know what I mean? They wouldn't be. I mean, there was probably like.
Yeah.
Similar. It was similar, but it got more.
Certainly, as
Of course, I mean, there's
things
no way
got.
It would be all perfectly designed right.
Yes and no. Again, the thing to remember is that this is a continuation of many Jewish practices, right? So I'm sure there's quite a bit that's very similar. There are hymns that we attribute to around this time, like "O Gladsome Light" and St. Simeon's Prayer, right? That we know to be very, very early church hymns. So, sure, was it strictly identical? No, obviously not.
I mean, that's what I'm saying.
But my point is that,
It was
you know,
more-
those that come in and go, wow, what the heck is all this? When did you guys get all fancy and weird about the meeting that they had, right? Well, you can tell by reading some of these very early church saints that it was not just getting together and having a little remembrance meal.
Yeah.
They clearly treat it as much more than that.
Yeah,
Liturgically and
like Justin Martyr
yeah.
and Polycarp and all them, like you could tell that if they came into an Orthodox church, they would agree with everything
Yeah.
that's going on. So
All right, the next general category I have are sometimes called the defenders of the faith. I want to be very clear, actually, before I go much farther. These little titles I've given, that's my own words. We don't have categories of saints like you'll find in the Catholic world, the doctors, and I don't even know what all they have. These like different categories that I don't even know what they're supposed to define. We don't do that. You're a saint, period. I have kind of grouped them just for ease of conversation into kind of the thing that they either were as monastics, that they did as defenders when in early church, right? But this is not any kind of formal distinction. The one exception, I suppose, being, well, even that's not truly, but like hierarchy versus martyr versus monastic, right? Like, I guess there is a little bit of a difference, but at the end of the day, a saint is a saint. We don't give any priority to this one over that one because that one's a doctor and that one's not, or whatever, right? Saint is a saint. They're all wonderful people to read. They all have good things to say. All right. My section, Defenders of the Faith. First and foremost here, I think it would be wrong to not put St. John. He's certainly not the first chronologically, but he's literally called the Golden Mouth. So Chrysostom means Golden Mouth. It's not like a family name or surname or something like that. It means Golden Mouth. And in languages other than English, it is usually translated, but for some reason in English we don't tend to do that. But if you look through the hymns, there are so many references to golden proclamations, golden tongued, golden mouthed, whatever. He wrote extensively on all sorts of things. And actually, I shouldn't really say write. That's not strictly speaking true. He spoke in homilies and it was recorded, which is why if you read through him, which I do recommend, he's actually, of all the saints, he's fairly approachable. Sometimes they can be challenging, but his are very, they're sermons, so they tend to be very approachable. However, he can be a little meandering sometimes, as you might expect for someone speaking rather than writing. He'll get started, he'll establish that we're going to talk about this thing and then go wildly off on why you guys need to stay away from the horse races or something like that. But he always does eventually come back. But anyway, in addition to the many theological writings and stuff that we have today, or recordings of homilies that we have today, he is also attributed to many of our prayers. If he didn't write them, then at least editing them. The prime example being the Divine Liturgy, right? Putting a lot of work into simplifying the rubrics of the Divine Liturgy to make it a bit shorter from what would have been more normal at the time, much longer services. It was his opinion that it was better to have people in for a shorter thing than, well, off at the horse races, as he liked to come back to quite a bit. So he's, I often recommend if you're just looking to kind of explore all manner of theological topics, take a look at his stuff. A lot of it's, well, nearly all of it, I don't know, has been translated into English, so there's a lot of good options out there. And like I said, it is very approachable as compared to some saints, which have good things to say, don't get me wrong, but they can be rather dense and hard to get through sometimes.
Very simple too.
Yeah.
And like I said, even though he may go off topical sometimes, it's not something like St. Gregory the Theologian where you might have to read that paragraph a couple of times.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. But he's also really relatable too with his I think the other is examples.
Homilies.
Yeah.
Again, a lot of the other saints, even some of the ones on this list here, are like writing theological treatises against someone else's theological treatise, and so they tend to get more technical and be, tying things more to some of the philosophy of the age and stuff like that, which can just make it hard to get through. For St. John, it's just the sermons that he was giving to all of the people that were there. Also, I may be of note, he was serving liturgy every day and giving homilies every day. So you can actually kind of read them in series as he talks about a subject over multiple days. And so sometimes you'll have a tangent that goes for nearly an entire sermon, but then he'll come back the next day and continue on whatever the main topic was. So anyway, good one to read. Also, St. Basil the Great, he worked and wrote extensively against Arianism, which, if you recall, was one of the first really major heresies the church had to face, and was one of the first times that we really see a lot of things being solidified that, we're definitely, again, just to be very clear, not made up then, but solidifying the practices as the church had been doing them, coming together and agreeing, like, okay, you're saying that version, you're saying that slightly different version, so how do we want to all say it together so we're unified against this Arianism thing? He was very instrumental in a lot of that, and again, just working and writing to combat the heresy. He's also very much considered to be a model hierarch for his support of the poor, and I have in here, he's credited with being one of the first to establish a hospital, a poorhouse, and a hostel for the homeless. His focus on charity was admirable. So that's St. Basil. Also, I didn't put it here explicitly, but also the liturgy, right? We do St. Basil's liturgy through the year. So very instrumental in the life of the church. My own child is one of them is Basil. Not as common of a name here in the U.S., but yeah, it is more common abroad. In the Slavic lands, Vasily is a very popular name, like our bishop. So, yep. St. Nicholas of Myra. If you remember the icon next to the crucifixion over there is an icon of St. Nicholas. He is known for his love and support of the poor and for many, many miracles. I highly recommend maybe the next St. Nicholas Day coming up in a month and a half-ish.
First Saturday of December.
Yeah. So a month-ish, yeah. Go read some of his life, read about some of the miracles that he performed, because it's pretty incredible. He was very well known for his love and support of his flock. And also very famous for being the one that directly opposed Arius and either punched or slapped, depending on the account, the heretic in the middle of the assembly. Of course, he was defrocked for that, because that's not generally okay, but he was reinstated the next day after a vision was given to the presiding hierarchs there. He is commemorated, there's the major feast day that you just called out, but he is actually commemorated on a regular cycle. Does anyone know? You're very close, but you're missing a key element. It's the particular day we do Matins on.
Oh, Thursday?
It's every Thursday, yeah.
Okay, that would make sense, because I was going to ask that, because I hear all the time in Matins, Holy Hierarch, St. Nicholas, pray to God for
Yeah.
us. And I was always wondering, is it that particular one every day that we're saying that, or is it just whatever
Yeah.
reason? Like, what's it?
Each day of the week has a different commemoration. Thursday is for the apostles and for St. Nicholas. So you hear a start with the canon to the apostles, and then the canon to the hierarch, and then the canon to whomever else is commemorated that day. Yep. And there are so many parishes to St. Nicholas. He is one of the most popular saints in the Slavic world. So many, many parishes, many people named Nicholas, Nikolai, various forms of that. Very, very well-known saint. Jolly old St. Nicholas.
So how do we get from St. Nicholas to this one to the one we call today Santa Claus?
Coca-Cola? I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean,
Because he did look red, and the icons that I see him were having that type of
sometimes the color for nativity is red, so.
Yeah. I mean, in the sense of like that outfit that we associate.
Yeah, the white fur-trimmed red
Yeah.
garment. Yeah, I don't know what that.
Reindeers and stuff.
They say Saint Nicholas the Santa Claus.
Yeah, that's
He
Yeah,
You
jolly,
might-
jolly old St. Nicholas, right?
Oh,
Good old Saint Nick.
Yeah.
okay, I never put that together.
Yeah.
So he'd probably go around and give out free gifts, I guess, right?
He is known. Yeah. So there are a few instances in his life where he gave gifts to people.
And set up
Um,
a Christmas tree and all that?
No, that's a Nordic thing. No, I don't know the chimney thing. I have no idea where that came from.
That's what I'm saying, something.
The tradition in a lot of places is to leave shoes out for St. Nicholas Day. So one of the stories goes that he was within his town. There was a poor man who had, I don't know, 3-4 daughters, something like that, and they were trying to get married and didn't have anything for the endowment. And so, as each one came of age, he, in the night, gave the family anonymously a bag of coins to pay for the endowment, but they didn't know it was him. So, yes, I guess in a sense known for giving gifts, at least at one time.
Yeah.
I presume that he was known for being generous, as many saints are. So, but yeah, I don't know how we got to the exact depiction of Santa riding stuff and reindeer and living in the North Pole with a bunch of elves and
Yeah, it's kind of a shame, really.
who knows.
I was
All right.
really upset when I found out that Santa Claus wasn't real.
He is real. He's just not like that.
Yeah.
All right. Saint Athanasius of Alexandria also fought very hard against Arianism, has a lot of writings. He is likely the one that introduced the 40-day Lenten period into the Greek churches and was the first to identify the 27 books of I say New Testament. I don't think I mean New Testament there. The Bible, Old and New, I think, that we use today. So if you recall very, very quickly here, just an aside on that note, there is no canon that explicitly says these books in the Orthodox Church. There's several conflicting canons, and what they do is they say this person said the right thing, except those people said different things. So what that means is that in the early church, it was up to each diocese to say these are the approved books to use, to be reading and preaching from and that kind of thing. And so we have many different lists from different hierarchs in different places saying, these books, not these books, that kind of thing. St. Athanasius was the first to give the list, at least that we know of, that matches the set of books we use today.
The Gospels, pretty much anybody would be like, wow, that's a lot different than this
Yeah.
thing. It's kind of like...
Yeah, I think New Testament there must be an error, and I don't know how I didn't catch that, but I think meaning all Scripture, Old and New.
Maybe instead of books, maybe books and epistles.
Yeah, something like that. So, anyway, yeah, no, I don't know. It must be New Testament because the Old Testament was never questioned in our, and we wouldn't think that there's more than 27 if you include them. So, yeah, it must be New Testament.
Because it says that the Bereans were searching the Scriptures daily, so they were obviously already Scriptures for the Old Testament.
Oh, yeah, no. I'm just pointing out that, it wasn't questioned, so it must have been the New Testament. I don't know why I'm thrown off. Ignore me. I'm getting old, except I'm not really, but whatever.
Long day.
Something like that, yeah. St. Athanasius is fairly well known to this day. I mean, his icon is pretty common to find on churches amongst the various fathers of the church. I think he's often depicted amongst the hierarchs in the altar. Not always, but it's not a very common name in the U.S., but it's fairly common in the Greek world, Athanasios, or various forms thereof.
So when we look at some of the, like St. Paisos or that's what he really looked like.
That's St. Seraphim.
Yeah, I know. So what I'm trying to say is like when we have the saints from the year 300 and 200, that's probably should be what they really look like because people knew how to draw back then, right?
Yes. So I think you have to remember, so especially some of the ones that are coming out of the Slavic world, they tend to be a little more realistic. The Byzantine time, as you can tell, was a lot flatter, and we've kind of actually retroactively gone back, and like the more common American style is more towards the Byzantine flat, but does have some smooth highlighting and stuff like that. So But anyway, all that to say, yes, to a certain extent. I don't think there's any reason that you would see, if you saw the person and the icon side by side, that you wouldn't be able to recognize that those are the same people. But some things, like for example, the balding head that you see on many saints, like St. John and the three hierarchs there, was specifically used as a
Big brain.
wisdom, right? Yeah, it was used as a like symbology kind of thing to show that they were wise. Were they actually balding? I mean, maybe, sure. I mean, it's certainly not unheard of for men to bald. We even have a name for that. But did they necessarily, and did it necessarily look like that? You know.
And as far
But-
as like the Theotokos and of course our Lord Jesus Christ, do we know, like we have saints who've seen her?
Yeah.
So they would say yes, that's what she looks like. And same with
I've never
Christ.
heard of any saint having a revelation of the Theotokos or Jesus, someone being like,
No.
oh, that's not what the icons look like.
No, I just like for clarification, because I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure that's from what I see is like whenever I see a saint who sees the Lord or that sees the Theotokos,
Yeah.
that they
I mean, if you look at the icons just above your head, they're all of the same person. There are differences between those icons. And yet there's also some similarities, right?
yeah.
So again, I imagine if you had the person and the icon next to each other, it would not be hard to tell that they're the same person. Would they be identical? No. But, you know, yes.
And I
Obviously,
remember-
people did know how to draw back.
I looked on one time. I asked YouTube or AI or something about it. Is the Orthodox icon of Jesus? Is that what he really looks like? And on that it says it's just a picture. They don't know for sure. And
I mean, we have an icon made without hands, right? That's what that one is up there.
Yeah, the one with me in the stuff.
That was made by Jesus.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Um,
Or the one in Catholic Pro, the Theotokos, I mean, where it's still similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So-
Sword to that one.
I mean, you will see things sometimes where a culture will, like for example, in America, you see these very whitewashed
Yeah.
images of Jesus. You can find some images in Asiatic areas that have very more Asian type of
Yeah.
facial features, right? And to a certain extent, okay, you know, certainly makes the people a little more relatable to look more like you. On the other hand, yeah, they didn't look like that. Jesus was not blonde-haired and blue-eyed. So, but yes, our general understanding is that the icons look like the person.
Yeah, the reason why they're always the same.
Not
I mean, it's
not photographic, obviously,
Okay.
right? There is a style to them, but yeah. All right, that's the halfway mark, so we got to keep going because we're not quite through the first page. These monastic saints are well known and well loved. Some of them a little more than others. Just like the martyrs, you will find that just because someone is a monastic doesn't mean that they're only loved by monastics. There certainly are those saints that are very focused in their work amongst monastics, and therefore we don't remember as much. But many saints, we just don't really even think about the fact that they were. St. Anthony the Great, being the first one here, wrote the rules for monasticism, more or less. He's really considered the father of monasticism today. He was very rich and sold it all to enter the desert. But despite all of that, he was invited to speak at the Council of Nicaea. So clearly he was known for his wisdom and eloquency even at the time. I don't think there's a whole lot attributed to him in terms of writings to this day, but
Just the life of Anthony.
but yeah, his life is very inspiring to people,
he was in
especially
a
the
cave and he fought demons all the time.
yeah.
That's what
So
he was
he's a very inspiring figure.
doing.
Unlike the defenders all either wrote or their homilies were recorded, that kind of thing. Not as much here with the monastics. Saint Seraphim is an extraordinarily popular saint. He's not quite modern enough to have me include him in the modern saints, but he's not exactly a long time ago, living in the 18th century. Russian saint, he was well known for miracle working and for his very effective spiritual guidance. He spent many years as a hermit struggling with many spiritual struggles before eventually returning to the monastery, opening his cell and receiving visitors, countless visitors, every day. I think, at least here in the U.S., you'll probably find an icon of him in pretty much every OCA or ROCOR or any of the Slavic types of bent churches. Although, honestly, probably wouldn't surprise me at all to see him in some of the other, Byzantine ones as well. He's very well known. Many people take his name, so you'll run into a good number of seraphims, and it's after him. Not as many churches, but there are a few. So, and then St. Mary of Egypt, whose life I hope you know, 6th century, and we know her life through Abba Zosima, or Saint Zosima, who recorded it and distributed her life widely after her death. Of course, it's read as part of the Lenten journey. Again, not known for her, eloquent defenses of the faith, not known for her, standing up before the whatever, just being very, very saintly, very holy in her own way, and remembering her life as a good example of that. It's not as common for people to take her name, interestingly. There are other Marys that I think would take precedence if you're going to pick that name, but certainly are some. All right, martyrs. Again, as I've said many times, countless martyrs, but at least a few of the, more popular ones, more notable ones. St. Stephen the Proto-Martyr, as it implies, the first martyr, apostle and archdeacon. He was a convert from the Hellenistic Jews, and the Jews didn't like that he was preaching Jesus, and so they stoned him. A young Saul, who would later become the Apostle Paul, was present and witnessed St. Stephen's death. He actually held the robes for the people that were taking them off to throw stones, in his own way supporting the death of Stephen, which he comments on, I believe, a few times at least. One of the things he's well known for is praying for his persecutors as they stoned him. So, very good witness to the faith. Not probably the only Stephen people could be named after, but certainly one of the more popular ones. St. George, the great martyr, as the name implies, is well loved. Roman soldier under Diocletian. If you know anything about Diocletian's rule in the 4th century, it was rather brutal, as was the case with several of these Roman emperors. They did not treat the Orthodox Church very well and were the cause of many martyrs. He rose very quickly, being very effective at being a commander, but ultimately, after a brutal edict from the emperor, he decided he had to confess Christ and was martyred after being tortured immensely. So many churches named after him, and people, not so much in the Slavic world, very common in the Antiochian world. So many St. George, Orthodox Church, so many people named George, very common name. He's the one, if you remember, do we have an icon of him?
No, I think that was Theodosius. Oh, no, yeah, I think he's right above.
Oh, yeah, there you go. He's nearly always depicted on a horse with the spear of the dragon. George and the Dragon, St. George and the Dragon. So you might hear. I think there's a book by that title also. Very well loved. And then St. Catherine of Alexandria, the daughter of a governor. Her mother was a Christian. She was asked to pray to an icon of the Theotokos and Christ to find a husband, which she ended up accepting Christ and chrismation and did not marry, instead dedicating herself to Christ. But her martyrdom was drawn out, and so that process gave her ample time to talk to the crowds and to many people, and converted quite a few on her way to martyrdom. There's several people that have similar. I think Saint Anastasia has a similar story, kind of being well known for her beauty, and therefore the torturers trying to convince her not to do this whole Christian thing, and it just kind of gives her more time to preach to people and convert them. I've talked before about the role of martyrs in the church, but each of these in their own right, of course, are expressing their love of Christ, and so we remember them for that. In the case of some of these, though, they also were beyond just a good witness, actively preaching and converting people by their words as they're being tortured and ultimately killed.
That's got to be the highest honor.
Yeah, you have to imagine. I mean,
That a man died for his friend, right?
yeah, I have to imagine it would have been a very powerful witness for the people. I mean, as evidenced by the number of people that converted. But yeah. All right, some of the more modern saints are well loved. Please don't take their names in baptism for the most part.
I was going to take Saint Paisios until you.
Paisios has become so common in the Orthodox world that most people probably wouldn't bat an eye, but I guarantee you outside of it, no one will have any idea what that name is.
But at least I can say his name now, because before I was like, hey, I want to be Saint Paisios. He's like,
Yeah.
you got to first learn his name if you want to be that.
Paisios.
You told me that last time, so I'm like, okay.
Yeah. Paisios, Silon, Sophrony, Nectarios. Not exactly common names in the U.S. Wonderful saints, definitely, absolutely. Rightly well loved, but very foreign sounding names. Saint Paisios. You'll note by the years of their death, quite recent, 1994. He was an Athonite monastic known for his gentleness and acceptance of those who sought his spiritual advice. There's a number of examples that people have of person with X or Y or Z thing coming and talking to him and being given very salient and effective advice. And he taught a lot of things. Again, I don't know that there's a lot that was written by his own hand, but there's a lot of things from him that are the various forms of counsel he gave people that have been recorded and even to this day continue to be translated and published. He is a very pastoral saint. So if you ever are struggling with something and find his words on whatever that thing may be, they're likely to be very powerful and helpful. And many of the books that do publish his guidance do it in the form of someone came to him asking about this, here was his response, and then it goes on for a few paragraphs, page or two, whatever, and then the next one, someone came to him asking about blank, and his response to that. So again, very, very good, very edifying writings. St. Silon the Athonite was actually a Russian, but went to Mount Athos, and so that's what we remember him by. He apparently was only barely literate. Coming when he did out of, let's just say that the lower classes in Russia were not terribly well educated prior to the revolution, and then he went to a monastery, which in our land is focused on worshiping God and not necessarily on education, so just didn't really need it. But his counsel was sought by many, many, many people, and he kind of kicks off a chain of people being the disciple of the disciple of the disciple of him, that to this day people will track. And so you might hear someone say, oh yeah, this is the book of Saint so-and-so who was a disciple of this person who was a disciple of Saint Silon. Very well loved. His life is definitely inspiring, and I do recommend reading it if you have the chance, as is the case with all these people, obviously. But and then, of course, as I mentioned, this chain. So his one of his disciples was Saint Sophrony. There were many, but Saint Sophrony is one of them, probably most well known. Saint Sophrony of Essex, also well known for his writings and spiritual counsels. He founded the monastery in Essex, England, which is still active. I think that's where Bishop Callistos Ware spent or Metropolitan Callistos Ware spent some of his time before his recent-ish repose. You will absolutely hear people that have connections to him, given his, the year of his death. One of the actually husband and wife pair that teach at the seminary I went to, St. Tikhon's, I think, converted at that monastery, and so we're very familiar with his teachings and people associated with Saint Sophrony. One of the books that I read during Lent this last year, Remember Thy First Love by Archimandrite Zacharias, I believe, is a disciple of Saint Sophrony. So again, kind of continuing this chain of people from Saint Silouan. Saint Nectarios, if you don't know his life, there was a movie published not that long ago of his life that's very powerful and inspiring. I don't know that I need to say too much about him here because of that. I suspect you probably know a good bit about him. If not,
He's awesome.
go watch the movie. It does a pretty good job of covering his life. I will just say that the movie pretty much ends at his death. That is certainly not the end of the story. There are many, many miracles attributed to his relics into the present time. So, well-loved saint.
They started venerating him like the day he was passed.
Yeah, I think there's a story of even like when he was in the hospital of healing the person in the bed next to him.
Oh, yeah, so when he passed away, the paralytic
Paraplegic.
the person was
Yeah.
paralyzed in the bed next to him, and when he passed away, his garments or something they put on top of him, and then he got healed.
So, very well-loved saint. Not so much in his life, but certainly after the fact. Actually, that's not even true. If you read about like his time teaching at the seminary there, he was well-loved there. He just had a few people that were very intent on tearing him down and were somewhat effective at that. So, all right. The next one here I have on this list is St. Luke of Simferopol. I don't think we have an icon of him here.
The surgeon.
Yes, the Blessed Surgeon, as he's sometimes known. He is an interesting individual. He was considered a brilliant surgeon and worked in pioneering the field of neuroscience and honestly surgery in general. Some of the practices that he pioneered and wrote papers on and stuff are still used to this day. They've just become the standard. But he became a bishop. He was consecrated a bishop, and he tried to not do the surgeon thing, and the USSR did not let him do that. They would imprison him and force him kind of back into service being a surgeon because they needed surgeons. So he was given a little bit of leeway because of that to do some stuff when he should have been in prison, but
He used to have the Theotokos up and then operate.
he would refuse to operate unless
I won't
the
operate
icon was
unless
up.
I
Yep.
have that.
Which the communists didn't like, but they did it anyway. He's known as an mercenary healer, never refusing to heal those in need, regardless of their ability to pay or otherwise recompense in some form or another. Again, another good life to read. Unlike some of the others, he never went to Byzantine lands, if that's your thing, anyway. And then St. Maria of Paris is the last one I have on here before we get into the North American ones, anyway, which I think some of you looked at before we started a little bit, but she's the mayor of a Russian town when the Bolsheviks came and ended up fleeing to Paris with her husband and children. But with the blessing of her husband, took monastic vows, started a poorhouse, which offered food to those in need, but she would frequently engage them in theological discussion, not as a requirement, but just like because she was talkative and people liked to have someone to talk to. And she was very effective at that. A lot of people ended up converting because of her. She's ultimately killed by the Nazis when she was found providing baptismal certificates for Jews seeking refuge. So she's considered a martyr as well.
Baptismal certificates?
Mm-hmm.
Do we still do that?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Yeah, I have a metrical book that I keep in the office that records all of them, baptisms and funerals and weddings and stuff like that. So it's only happened once in my time here, but someone did reach out and say, hey, I'm doing a thing and I need a copy of my baptismal certificate. And I go back and look through the book and find the date and whatever.
Can you give everyone a copy of the baptism?
I can.
Oh, you can. Oh.
Yeah. I mean, if you want one, yeah. All right. As I'm sure you are well aware, there are many North American saints. Of course, we've got their collection back here in our church. I don't include them here because really you should read their lives, right? These other ones, if you don't, okay. But you really should be familiar with the saints of this land. I list, I think, most of them here. St. Herman of Alaska, St. Innocent of Alaska, St. Tikhon of Moscow, St. Peter the Aleut, or the Protomartyr, depending on which epitaph you want to use. St. Raphael of Brooklyn, St. Nikolai of Zhitcha and South Canaan, St. John of San Francisco, St. Olga of Kwethluk, St. Alexander Hodovitsky, St. Alexis of Wilkes-Barre, St. Jacob of Alaska, St. Sebastian of Jackson, I want to say, St. Juvenali, St. Mardarie. There are definitely others. I'm sure I've forgotten a few on my own, and I'm sure there are others that I'm just not aware of. With only, I believe, a few exceptions, these are all immigrants that came here for various reasons. Sometimes they came specifically to be teaching in the new land, right? It's like St. Herman, right? Came over specifically to be bringing the church. Others, like St. Nikolai of Zhitcha, came over because of persecution. He actually spent a bunch of time in a concentration camp before coming and teaching at St. Tikhon Seminary for a year before he proposed. Some, like St. John, were sent to be clergy and hierarchs over here. There's many reasons why people ended up here, as is the case with pretty much everyone that ends up here. But one way or another, they all worked for the building up of the church here. Many of them you'll find were very big on using the language or languages of the people. So many of the Alaskan saints were very big on using the various native Alaskan languages down here. Saints like St. Tikhon and St. Raphael were very big on pushing English instead of Slavonic, because that's not what people spoke, right? Of course, the pendulum has kind of swung a little bit and is now kind of swinging back, I think, here, but regardless, that was from the get-go, right? The purpose of coming here was to establish a church and baptize all nations, and the only way to do that is by doing the services in a language, right? The Slavs looked to St. Cyril and Methodius doing the same thing to them, so the expectation was you go into a new land, you can, translate everything into their language. So read their stories, right? You don't need to memorize everything there is to memorize about them, but get a little more familiar with these American saints, because there are many of them, and like I said, they're the people from here. Sometimes quite literally, like St. John from the Bay Area. Others, at least, from the American lands. I've mentioned before, I can't remember off the top of my head which one it is, St. Innocent, St. Herman, one of them. One of the many icons has images from their life, or his life around the border, and one of them shows the saint riding in a helicopter. So, some of these were a little while ago, but not that long ago. They're all mostly fairly modern saints.
It would definitely have to be a little bit more modern ones. I don't think St. Herman or St. Innocent had a helicopter back then.
Yeah, you're probably right. That's a good point. I can't remember who it was, though. Anyway, St. Peter, I think, is probably the first North American saint, unless I'm forgetting someone.
Well, he's not a saint yet, maybe from Arizona. They said that they had a picture. You guys
Elder
know, so
Ephraim.
He was in Walmart.
Yeah, I think St. Ephraim, I believe. The one that created the monster that's in Arizona.
Yeah, I don't think he's been canonized, has he?
Yeah,
He's not
yeah.
canonized
But
yet.
he's starting to be
Elder
venerated.
Ephraim is what people will call
Elder
him.
Ephraim,
Yeah, there's many others, right? There's no this is certainly not an exhaustive list of the currently canonized saints, and it is absolutely not an exhaustive list of the saints that will be canonized. So yeah, there's certainly several. Father Seraphim Rose is another example of someone that many people consider to be a saint. There are other very saintly people that lived here who have very very good lives to read, very inspiring. Some of them have writings that can be very edifying and helpful. Saint Nikolai of Życia, if you're interested, was a huge proponent of English. When he was rector of the monastery at St. Tikhon's, he forced them to start doing English instead of Slavonic, which has been what they've been doing forever. And he preached entirely in English. He refused to preach in anything else. He wrote/translated many hymns into, not so much liturgical hymns, but just like prayers that you might do on your own, into English. So he has a number of very beautiful hymns, if you're ever curious to go look that up, that are either composed or translated by him. So that's at least my attempt at giving you some of the important saints whose names you will run into and who it is probably good to at least know a little bit about. Are there others that you have run into that you have questions about or anything like that, or?
No, I mean, it was kind of like what Mike was saying before the stream. It is kind of like this common thread between all of them, like the humility of all the saints too, though.
Yeah.
Granted, there are some controversial ones that aren't the most humble ones, but the vast majority, I think, that you run into, I think one of them that I remember reading was, I think it's Saint Moses of Tima, is it?
That is, I think, a saint.
Yeah.
I don't know what.
Always get mixed. It's like Optina or Optima, one, but he's
Optina, yeah.
Yeah, but the one that like always stood out for me from that one was that everybody knew he had clairvoyance, and he would always disregard it. Like, I don't know what you're talking about, and they would like repeatedly tell him, like, we know that you have this gift, and you just kind of refuse. But then he also had like this other side where he had a big temper, and so he wasn't, super, well-tempered, but he had this wonder-working ability, and so it's kind of like what you always kind of stress too, of all of them different aspects of different saints can relate to a lot of things. They're not just like, yeah, everybody has to be a martyr, or everybody has to have a certain wonder-working ability.
Yep.
There's so many threads that each saint could relate to somebody at some point.
I think there's a common pitfall in America today, especially amongst certain internet folk, to idolize monasticism as the thing that we should all be doing. And I hope that this list of saints highlights that certainly there are a number of very well-loved monastic saints, right? And there are many that aren't, right? We have a whole host of specifically married saints, husband and wife, that we remember as a pair. We just had one the other day, Galaction and Epistemus. But there are many others. They're certainly not the only couple. There are many who just, lived holy lives, and were not monastics, right? And that is the beautiful thing about the saints of the Orthodox Church, is that I think, kind of, if you can imagine a person, there's probably a saint that, struggled to something similar or had a similar situation. It's easy sometimes to think about, well, all of these old saints we read about from the year 300 or 400 or something like that. And yes, of course there are those, but again, there's plenty from, just a few decades ago. There are plenty, as you pointed out, that have yet to be canonized, but a lot of people sure seem to think probably will be. This is not relegated to the long ago, right? This is a continuing practice of the church to make saints. That's what we do. That's the goal for all of us. We might not all get our names on that list, but but it is the goal to live a saintly and holy life. So
I think it's probably too, because maybe it's just like you said, like an internet thing too. But people want to like point out the saints that live like the most hardcore lives, or like the Saint Georges of martyrs, like they have to be like that.
Yeah.
But then there's also Saint Olga, like she didn't do anything super crazy like that. Or even like Saint John Chrysostom. And sure, yeah, he had beautiful homilies and sermons, but sermons, and he's like in your defender of the faith category. I mean, I think the empress didn't like him because
Yeah.
he said certain stuff, and
Yeah.
he kept the faith in those types of things. So I think that's like another one to always remind ourselves when we explore more of the saints is don't get hung up on the ones that are the lesser ones that
Yeah.
don't have the crazier stories, because that's the life of Christ isn't always the one that's the result of the most extreme things, though.
No, that's a very good reminder. Yeah. It's part of why I try and have this particular list, is to highlight all of the different, ways that one can be a saint. I think there's sometimes a feeling of coming into Orthodoxy and feeling like you need to put off whatever you are and do that thing. And again, I kind of hope that this list of saints and their wide variety of backgrounds and spiritual gifts, or lack thereof, sometimes make it clear that there isn't like one way, right? There are so many different ways, whether you're an excellent surgeon or an excellent orator or excellent at being humble, right? There's so many different ways to be godly, to be saintly, to be holy, that don't rely on being an extreme faster. Certainly our saints, we remember, as the faster, that we're very good at that, but not everyone.
God does respond to that. I think it's not so much because they're doing crazy stuff, it's because they're showing how much they want to commune with God, how much they want to.
And again, right, part of being a Christian, part of following Christ, is to give what you are good at back to Him, right? That's what we're all called to do, right? We all have our own strengths and weaknesses, so play to your strengths and give those back to God. And that's what we see these saints doing very effectively, right?
Yeah, that's true.
You don't see St. Luke trying to do the same things that St. Mary did of Egypt, right? Right? Each has their own calling, and they very much excel in their area. Wonderful. Glory to God.
That's good.
Well, that's, right on time. So if there's nothing else, then I think I will see you all next week, at least.
At least tomorrow, maybe. Sunday,
All right. Thank you all.
Hey, Bob.